Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our monthly webinar series. Today's topic is a very interesting one, primary progressive aphasia. And as always, these webinars are made possible through a collaboration of providers, Care Choices, Hospice and Palliative Services, O'Connor Mortuary, Caring Companions at Home, and Alzheimer's Orange County. And I am Kim Bailey, a gerontologist with Alzheimer's Orange County, and I'll be your host today. Our sponsors provide these monthly webinars as a service to the community on topics of interest to anyone working in the field of aging and dementia or caring for a loved one. We know that you'll find the presentation informative and useful today. And we do have a wonderful expert with us. Her name is Dr. Gloria Jean Wallace. And Dr. Wallace, I assume you're standing by. Let me tell our audience about you. Dr. Gloria Jean Wallace is an American Speech Language Hearing Association Fellow and a board-certified Academy of Neurologic Communication Sciences and Disorders speech-language pathologist. Dr. Wallace serves as professor and chairperson, as well as coach and mentor for students and junior faculty in the Communication Sciences and Disorders Department at Rinker's Health Sciences Campus, Chapman University in Irvine, California. Dr. Wallace conducts research to enhance life participation for adults with aphasia and other neurogenic disorders. She's published and presented widely, including 2 textbooks, with a 3rd in progress that address diversity, equity, and inclusion for people with neurogenic communication and cognitive disorders from diverse communities. Dr. Wallace is also ordained as an interfaith minister and as a Christian minister with 6 units of clinical pastoral education in varied medical contexts, including hospice, a VA medical center, and a rehabilitation hospital. Dr. Wallace is a mother, grandmother, and owner of 2 toy poodles. She enjoys outdoor activities, sewing, reading, attending church, and talking with her 96-year-old mother. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Gloria Jean Wallace. Dr. Wallace, can you join us? There she is. Hello. How are you doing?
Fine. How are you?
Good, good. We're going to move your slides for you. So let's go ahead and go to the first slide.
Okay.
Michelle.
Yes.
Can you advance to the next slide?
It is.
Thank you. I must have a delay on my end. Okay, I'm going to go away and turn it over to Dr. Wallace. Dr. Wallace, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to this presentation. I understand that there are people possibly with primary progressive aphasia and their family members, as well as some professionals. I'm going to gear this more towards perhaps the needs of people who are suspecting that they might have primary progressive aphasia and or who actually know that they have this diagnosis and want to learn a little bit more. So it's going to be pretty user-friendly for that reason. Primary progressive aphasia is a relatively uncommon degenerative neurological problem. It's part of a general constellation of difficulties called frontotemporal dementia. So it's just one of several different possible problems. There's something called progressive supranuclear palsy and Huntington's disease, and there are a number of different diagnoses that could fall under that umbrella term of frontotemporal dementia. But we're going to focus on a couple of constellations of problems that fall under that big umbrella. We're going to focus on today primary progressive aphasia. And so the purpose
Dr.
of this...
Wallace, please tell me if I'm on the right screen. I haven't heard you say to move slides.
No, you're fine. So the
Okay,
purpose... Yeah, thank you. And I'll signal to you to help. So the purpose of this presentation is threefold: to provide a basic understanding of aphasia and dementia and associated terms in preparation for a discussion of primary progressive aphasia, and is to provide also information about supports and resources for people who have primary progressive aphasia and their families, and educational needs for society. So we have 3 objectives here today. And if you've got questions, I know there's a question answer period at the end, but feel free if you're needing some answers midway to signal. Is there a way for them to signal that? If
I
they've got
can
a
keep
question?
an eye, this is Kim, I'll keep an eye on the question box, and I'll certainly let you know if someone needs clarification or has a question. Thank you.
Okay, so it can be interactive. Okay. All right, so next slide. So first, let's talk about some terms so that we're all on the same page. So primary means main problem. Progressive, something that worsens over time. And then let's talk about some terms, aphasia and language. Aphasia is a term that refers to a language difficulty that has a medical cause. And usually when you think about aphasia, you think about causes being stroke or traumatic brain injury or tumor. Those are the most common causes of aphasia. And then when we talk about language or a language problem or language that's not problematic, we're referring to a person's ability to speak and to write and to understand what someone else is saying to them. And the ability of someone to express what they would like to communicate to someone. And that includes communication using sign language, you know, for people, for instance, who are deaf with a big D. So aphasia in language, language being non-impaired communication skills and aphasia being impaired communication skills, generally for one of the reasons that I mentioned before. And then dementia refers to a cognitive problem, very different from a language problem, a cognitive problem, not with language formulation, but with cognition. And when we talk about cognition, we talk about the ability to remember, like short-term memory is often more impaired actually if a person has dementia than long-term memory. Usually long-term memory is quite preserved. But when we talk about cognition, we talk about ability to remember, ability to think, ability to reason, and ability to make safe and logical decisions. So those are just some basic terms. So when we talk about primary progressive aphasia, now you should have a pretty good idea of what we're referring to, because the main problem, the primary problem here, is that we've got something going on that's progressive or that worsens over time and that results in aphasia. And A means lack of, and aphasia language, so lack of language or impaired language. Okay, so next slide. So a little bit more information about aphasia. Aphasia, or lack of language or impaired language, is generally, most often, an acute kind of a medical condition. When I say acute, I mean sudden onset, with difficulty with all forms of language, as we said in the previous slide, in terms of understanding, speaking, reading, writing, and also performance with math calculations. Cognition, in terms of memory, thinking process, and decision making, as we described it in the previous slide, those things are relatively intact. However, the language difficulties that the person has when they have aphasia, the language difficulties mask the communicative competence that the person has. So the person looks as though perhaps they have cognitive problems, but they don't, okay? They're masked because they can't communicate. All right, next slide. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about primary progressive aphasia. Let's hone in. Primary progressive aphasia is it's progressive and it's difficulty with aphasia, meaning it's progressive and we've got a language impairment. So with primary progressive aphasia, the aphasia isn't acute as it generally is if a person has a stroke, but somehow the person starts to have dissolution of language. They start to have problems with language. Let's see, go back one slide. Let's see, go back one slide. They start to have difficulty with language. And then over time, let's say within a 2-year period, the language gets worse and worse, 2 years or longer after onset of language difficulties. And the person starts to then, after that period, after the language gets pretty severely involved, pretty problematic, then you start to notice that the person is having, let's see, we're switching. Let's go back to the other slide. Okay, thank you. You can leave it there just for a minute. So after the person has developed language difficulties, then after about a 2-year period in general, then the person starts to have more severe communication difficulties, more severe difficulty understanding and expressing themselves and thinking of the words that they want to say as they're communicating. And in addition, about that time, when the language starts to get very severe, then you start to notice cognitive problems kicking in, cognitive problems then showing up, like problems with memory, especially short-term memory, difficulty with clear thinking, difficulty with decision making. So now you've got the language and the cognitive problems. It makes it very, very difficult to carry out day-to-day activities in a typical manner. So next slide. Okay. So primary progressive aphasia is a neurological medical condition that's progressive. The initial primary difficulty with primary progressive aphasia is with language. Specifically, the person presents with aphasia, a language impairment that is progressive. The language skills worsen over time. It's unlike dementia in that with dementia, usually the person has difficulty with the thinking process, the remembrance of things first, before there's a real frank difficulty with the language noted. Eventually, with dementia, the language dissolves as well, but it's just that with primary progressive aphasia, the first set of difficulties lie within the area of communication and language. Okay, so progressively worsening language impairment may remain the primary difficulty, lasting 2 years or longer without notable difficulty in cognitive abilities, especially memory, reasoning, even visual spatial skills and personality skills even may eventually kick in, may eventually present themselves, but not initially. Okay. Initially, there may be no changes in activities of daily living. They may be able to carry those out just fine, but just difficulty communicating. Okay, next slide. Okay, so some people with primary progressive aphasia, initial progressive language difficulty, may eventually develop dementia of 2 distinct types. They may develop into a person who has what's diagnosed as being Alzheimer's disease, and they may eventually evolve into a different type of difficulty. We may think that there's language, but they may have a different type of frontotemporal lobar degeneration other than PPA. So remember we said at the beginning of the presentation that frontotemporal degeneration includes a lot of different kinds of dementias, Pick's disease, and we mentioned Lewy body dementia and some other kinds of things. So know that there may be some other, we may originally think, oh, there's a lot of word finding. This must be primary progressive aphasia of a certain type that we'll talk about in a minute, but it may actually evolve into a different type of frontotemporal degeneration. Okay, and I'll just mention too that Alzheimer's is the #1 type of dementia. The majority of people who have dementia have that type of dementia. There are supposedly 6.5 million 65-year and older folks who live with Alzheimer's in the United States. 1 in 9 people age 65 and older presumably has Alzheimer's. So it's a pretty significant problem and is expected with the baby boomer age to actually increase. Now, this primary progressive aphasia, on the other hand, it affects fewer than 50,000 people in the United States, and it's relatively uncommon. But it still occurs, and if it occurs and affects you, whether it's common or not common, it's important, something to be attended to. It's a life changer. Okay, next slide, please. In the next slide, in this slide, I just wanted to mention three people. There are many other people, but three people in particular, just to associate with primary progressive aphasia. The first would be Dr. Arnold Pick. And Arnold Pick was the person who was the very first person to highlight the relationship between dementia and aphasia, or dementia and its relationship to language dissolution. And then the second person I'll mention is Dr. Mesalam. And Dr. Mesalam was the very first person in 1982, in an article that I have referenced at the end of this presentation. He was the very first person to describe primary progressive aphasia. And then I'll mention Dr. Gorno Tempini and colleagues, who in 2011 published a really nice article that provided us with consensus guidelines for classifying primary progressive aphasia into three different variants, or three different types. Next slide, please. The three different types are semantic progressive aphasia, agrammatic progressive aphasia, and logopenic progressive aphasia. With semantic progressive aphasia, the person has lots of difficulty understanding even single words. They may be in the room and you may say, "Oh, would you bring me a pillow?" And they're like, you know, "What's a pillow?" They somehow are not understanding. Perhaps they understand what you are asking them to do, but they don't understand even the simple word that you're saying with pillow. So they have difficulty understanding. That's giving you an example. Agrammatic progressive aphasia is difficulty producing speech and language, also called non-fluent agrammatic variant, because the person has difficulty as they're trying to express themselves. It's more an expressive difficulty than it is with understanding. They're understanding pretty well. It's just that they can't get the words out clearly, or they can't get the words out in a manner that is articulated properly so that you can understand clearly what they're saying. And then logopenic progressive aphasia, that's when the person has specific difficulty with word finding, coming up with the word that they want to say. Are you hungry? Yes, I want some, the long thing that you put that yellow stuff on, and put it in a thing you do that you wrap around. They may use empty words like that to express hot dog, for instance, if they can't think of the word. Now, people with semantic and agrammatic progressive aphasia also have word finding problems. It's just that the word finding difficulties are more prominent with the logopenic progressive aphasia. Okay, next slide. Okay, probably the very best video out there describing all you want to know, the basics of primary progressive aphasia, is the 60 minutes videotape. So I'm going to show you just a bit of it where they're talking about frontotemporal dementia, and hopefully this will prime a conversation for us later when we get to the question and answer period. Okay. Okay, so the next slide, the previous slide talks about all the different repercussions that a person might face if in fact they're diagnosed with primary progressive aphasia, and not just the person, but it's the whole network, their support network. And hopefully everybody doesn't have a good support network. Hopefully a person diagnosed with PPA does have a good supportive network, because it's extremely important. In terms of the medical diagnosis, generally it takes, it's not instant. It takes like several years. Oftentimes you'll hear people say, to get a good medical diagnosis. And what happens is, you start to notice some difficulties with language more than usual. Everybody has some difficulty thinking of words and articulating. They stumble just a bit. Everybody does, every now and then, right? But if you notice that it's happening more and more, then you'll want to mention that to your primary care physician. And the primary care physician, will do a number of different tests, the medical records, they'll look at your history, they'll get a detailed bit of information about what you're describing, and then perhaps talk to your family member to get their perspective so that they can put all the pieces of the puzzle together. They may order physical exams and tests and other sorts of things. They may even order neuroimaging kinds of measures to try and put everything together to figure out if in fact there's something suggesting primary progressive aphasia. And if they do this set of things and they determine that maybe you do have that, then they generally will refer you out to a neurologist so that they start to build up a team. They might even, once the neurologist confirms that you've got that issue, then they'll suggest that you see a neuropsychologist to kind of wrap things up and really put the package together. That's going to be another team member. And then with difficulties that you may face and that you undoubtedly will face as you get the diagnosis, you may be referred to a psychologist who will also be an important part of your team. And because it affects language first, you will have a speech language pathologist on your team who will assess the different kinds of challenges you have, as well as the strengths that you have that you can use as tools to communicate, because that's the functional outcome, for you to be able to communicate and for you to be able to communicate as long as possible. I mentioned a psychologist, and I'm actually taking right now a series of courses to become an end-of-life doula. And as I'm studying some of this information, it really occurs to me that a lot of the things that people face at end of life in terms of the dramatic shift in what's happening to them and what's happening to their life and what future looks like and the impact on loved ones, their role in the family, finances, all sorts of things. People oftentimes, and I had not actually thought about this before, but they oftentimes go through different stages. Everyone doesn't go through the same stage, but they may go through adjustment stages. So if you find yourself as a person who has been diagnosed or your family member has been, you may be in the middle of one of these stages, or you may recall having gone through different stages of denial. No, this can't really be this. No, let's go get a second, third, fourth, fifth opinion. This can't be what you're describing, because this is something that's not acute, that gets better, but it's degenerative, and so it's suspected to be something that's going to get worse. So denial, and then anger at everyone, anger at life. Why is this happening to me, and why is this happening to my loved one? Just at the time when we were going to do X, Y, Z. Oftentimes it happens to people in their 60s, at a very ripe and right period when people are trying to, accomplish a lot of fun things, right? And they're about to retire and whatnot. And then bargaining. And after bargaining, oftentimes people fall into a slump of depression. And then after that, then they may come out accepting what's happened. But it all depends on how strong the support system is. And so I want to talk a minute about support system and finding support system. First of all, we mentioned the doctor. That's the first go-to person. You want to make sure that it's a doctor, it's a person who is easy to talk with, and a person who easily understands what you're sharing, and that takes time to listen to you and to listen to your concern in a serious kind of a manner. And then I've got a couple of references at the end that I'll show you that talk about building a team. And so if your PCP or your primary care physician doesn't build a team for you of different people that really need to feed in together to come up with a diagnosis and to help support you through this, to provide you with a network of support. If your physician doesn't do this, then you need to take it upon yourself to do it. The family member, or you, if you don't have a lot of family members to help. while you're in the early stages, so that, you know, you've got the neurologist, you've got the psychologist, you've got the different people that you need to support you. You've got a speech pathologist you feel comfortable with. And then you need to be very verbal about making sure that the people who do see you in therapy, like the neuropsychologist, will look to see, do you have any dementia kinds of characteristics or cognitive kinds of characteristics, and they will track to see when those kinds of issues start to kick in. But the speech language pathologist will be really concerned with finding out, who are you? What context do you live in? What's important to you? How is your communication now? If you've identified that you've got problems, what are the problems? How serious are they? Is it to the point that you are isolating yourself, or do people stop coming over because they don't feel comfortable in knowing how to best communicate with you? In which case, if that's the case, the speech pathologist will work with you. They will look at the things that you are still able to do well despite the language difficulties that you're having, and they will build on those things to help you find the better, easiest way, best way to communicate yourself in a clear manner, be it verbally, or, you know, with writing, or with pictures to supplement when you get stuck on getting the concept out. And they will also work with your family members and other people in your support network, like if you attend synagogue or church or mosque. There's no reason why you would ever have to stop doing that, as long as people in that environment understand what's happened to you and they are trained by a speech pathologist, for instance, to understand how to best communicate with you, to make you still feel welcome in those contexts, or club contexts, or sorority, fraternity, or whatever is important to you. When the primary progressive aphasia gets to an extent that it's getting severe and starting to affect cognition, then it will start to affect perhaps activities of daily living, and you may have to retire if you haven't already. And so it's going to be really important for people in your world to understand that you need to have autonomy, that even though you may start to have difficulties with remembering things and with the thought process, that you still need to be given every opportunity as much as possible to be autonomous, to feel respected to the point that you can still make decisions. There may be simple decisions, maybe the more complicated decisions you can't make, maybe you can't drive anymore, that sort of thing. But simple kinds of decisions, rather than just people catering to you or doing for you, is extremely important, including continuing with, or finding, if you never had, some nice hobbies and ways to fill your day. Extremely important, so that you realize that your life, despite any communication difficulties you're having, your life is still of value, because it absolutely is. So now in the next slide, let's see if this one, I have two other videos. Okay, we can try the next slide. So these two slides show you, they're really good, show you what the communication might sound like. So please look at these, you know, at the end, but they show you, they're good, really good examples of what the communication sounds like. And in addition, they'll touch your heart, because they show you spouses accepting this, and people themselves accepting what's happened. I mean, not that it's easy at all, but it shows you that there's hope. It shows you that with the right kind of support to support you as a person with primary progressive aphasia and as a family, that you can get through this. They talk in the videotapes about challenges, finding out about the disease, and treatment for the disease. Well, there is no treatment. There's no medical treatment, and there's no pharmaceutical treatment. There's no medicines that you can take to make this progressive disease not progress. It's going to progress. But in terms of therapy, as I mentioned, with speech language pathology therapy, you can, in fact, for as long as possible, be able to communicate in your world, in your context, and your loved ones will understand and how to best support your communication. So they talk about, in the videos, they talk about the financial and economic difficulties. They talk about adjusting to daily activities and roles that you might have had. You might have been the breadwinner or supplementing income, and now you can no longer do that. It talks about social consequences and isolation that occurs because of this problem. It talks about a wide range of feelings and emotions, like I sort of talked about when we were talking about the Kubler-Ross stages as you transition into finding out you have this diagnosis. It talks about caregiver responsibilities and how difficult it is, how challenging it is for caregivers to deal with all the changes and also deal with the extra things, the extra chores that they have to do. And so the person with primary progressive aphasia needs support, but then the caregiver needs support also. And there are many ways to reach out and get support. And so in terms of how to improve quality of life, they talk about that in the videos too. They talk about the medical team, as we mentioned earlier, how important that is, how the medical team generally comes up with a care plan, with including referrals, so that you're not alone. You know who to go to reach out to get some help, to get some support. And then don't feel hesitant about communicating what's happened to family, to friends, to faith-based community centers to get support. They want to, that's what they do. They give support in faith-based places. So go to them, reach out and ask for the support that you're needing. The support that you need is going to be ongoing. So it's important to connect with others. It's a rare disease. There are rare disease organizations that you can reach out to that will give you information, as well as organizations dedicated to aphasia that also talk about primary progressive aphasia, and their primary progressive locations where, like there's one at Northwestern that I'll show you in just a minute. Well, here it's on here now. The primary progressive aphasia program at Northwestern is huge. And so you can go to that site and find out about all kinds of things. They even have virtual support groups. Now, it's my understanding that our Alzheimer's Association of Orange County also has a variety of a lot of different support groups. So they're there for you as well. Then there's the National Aphasia Association, and then another group called Aphasia Access. It's mainly for people who have aphasia. Access is for people who have acquired aphasia, but they also have a lot of really good information for people who have primary progressive aphasia. There are organizations that provide financial support. There are places you can go to for crisis help. You're totally stressed out. As a person with PPA or as a caregiver, you just can't do one more doggone thing. There are places you can call to get help, because this disease really torments people. It's really, really, really challenging. But again, there is hope. Important to connect with others. Extremely important to connect with others. I can't say it enough. I've said it a million times. That's kind of the key. And if you're single, divorced, don't have children, don't have a big network, try and think of a place, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, somewhere where you can go and get some support, and as well as the Alzheimer's Association that has groups specifically to cater to what your needs might be. And then let's see, the last slide, I'm just going to mention one thing. Let's see, you can go ahead and put the next slide up. Okay. These are three. There are lots of hundreds of really interesting articles, but these are perhaps three of the most interesting, I thought, that talk about primary progressive aphasia, not too technical. So if you're a person with primary progressive aphasia or family member, you might find these pretty user-friendly and fairly easy to read, especially after this, basic introduction to what PPA is all about. And then I'll mention the third one. Has listed here Maya Henry, and I'll mention Maya Henry. She actually has some really nice little webinars on YouTube that you might want to go to and look at. And she describes and gives you examples of primary progressive aphasia. That's her specialty. She's a speech language pathologist. And I'll also mention that we have something called the Learning Lab here at Chapman University. And Ms. Lisa LaChance is the director of our Learning Lab, and she, in the Learning Lab, entertains the needs of people who have many different kinds of neurological difficulties and would certainly be open to taking in someone who has primary progressive aphasia. And we're doing different sorts of research projects in our department related to primary progressive aphasia. So please contact us if you have any needs in that realm. Okay, and then the last thing, I'm going to close with very interesting story. I've seen several cases not too long ago who, in the recent past, I've seen over my career, I've been a speech pathologist for a long time, 40 plus years. But recently, I've seen a couple of people with primary progressive aphasia, and one in particular was so interesting when they presented, and I'll just tell you this in case any of you can relate to this. And it just popped in my head to tell you this. I wasn't going to put this in my presentation, but I think it's important and I should. This person came to me and initially they said, I have a head injury and I've got some problems with communication. And they were pretty significant problems with communication, getting the words out and whatnot. And so I asked for the medical records so that I could properly look to see what the history was and all that, and they just couldn't seem to get them. And so I went ahead and evaluated the person anyway, and I found out they were attending an aphasia group. And as it turns out, the person later I found out actually had a diagnosis of primary progressive aphasia, but they were sort of in denial. So it didn't really impact what I did in therapy because I was still doing the same sorts of things that I would have done regardless of what the problem was. But what I didn't know, because I didn't originally have that diagnosis of primary progressive aphasia, I didn't know that they probably needed a psychologist and a lot of support, because they were in an aphasia group, and that's where I first saw them, thinking that this was going to get better. They didn't understand that primary progressive, when they had that diagnosis, they latched onto the word aphasia, and they thought they were going to get better. So as soon as I did see the medical records, I did advise them gently otherwise, and then we did build in, a whole network. But because of that word aphasia, I'm giving you this story, because of that word aphasia, don't lock into it and read about aphasia and think, oh, it's going to get better, because it generally doesn't. But there's support so that as you get more and more severely involved, people will work with you and help adjust and adapt your communication partners and help to support you so that you are able to make decisions and so that you are able to communicate through your entire lifetime. Okay? So that you feel valued throughout your entire lifetime. Okay, so finally, I'll say before our questions, thank you for being here today, and thank you for dialoguing. We'll go back. One slide. Thank you for dialoguing together about this very important topic. I hope that you leave, more than anything, if you suspect that you have it, don't be afraid, go see your PCP. I hope that you're empowered to know enough that you can go forward and walk through this process to see what's going on. And if you have primary progressive aphasia, I hope I've said something to spark some additional hope in your life, and maybe you can share with us how you've managed through this. So I hope you leave empowered with the basic information about primary progressive aphasia, a framework for what to do, what to think about if you suspect that you and your loved one may have primary progressive aphasia, and information about resources, where to go for help, and the kind of help that may be of benefit to you and your loved ones as you navigate PPA or another progressive disease that affects communication and cognition. You do not have to go it alone. And just more than anything, remember that if you don't remember anything else about this presentation, you never have to go it alone. The Alzheimer's Association of Orange County and others, we're here for you at Chapman. We will support you in any way we can. Okay?
Thank you so much, Dr. Wallace, for that extremely informative webinar. And we do have some questions for you. If some of you may still be writing, if you have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat box. And before we begin that, I just want to mention that if by any chance we run past our regular time, 12:30, our presenter has agreed to stay for a few minutes. If we do run past, you're welcome to remain online or listen to the answers. But if you need to leave the webinar, you can. Just remember that if you want to get CE credit, you have to stay on for the full 60 minutes. Also, before we begin our question and answer period, I want to take this opportunity once again to thank our sponsors, O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choices, Hospice and Palliative Services, Caring Companions at Home, and Alzheimer's Orange County. And Dr. Wallace mentioned that, that Alzheimer's Orange County does have some specialized groups. We do have a virtual support group for caregivers who have a family member with FTD or Lewy body. If you want more information about that, you can give our helpline a call. Dr. Wallace, that was so great. Let me open up the question box. And I just wanted to comment too that I was just thinking about the stigma around this illness and, you know, the fact that people who are often struggling with aphasia don't yet have a cognitive impairment, but yet they may be treated as though they do. So I think it's a good reminder to all of us to kind of watch for that sort of built-in bias we might have. We might not even be conscious of it. And to remember, just because people have speech problems, it doesn't mean that they necessarily have cognitive issues as well. So we want to treat everybody with respect. Is that right?
That's correct. And I'll just mention that, you know, speech language pathologists work with family members, and it's really interesting. You know, I'm a minister. You'd mentioned that in addition to a speech pathologist. And part of my calling was I work with so many people, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Wiccan, all kinds of people, right? Everybody has something different. And it's interesting how many people came to me, and when I would say, well, what's important to you? And they would say, you know, this, you know, a mosque is important, or this is important, a church, or this, whatever. So I would go talk to the minister to say, oh, would you like, you know, free communication partner training? You know, I can do that. I can have my students help and do this. And they would say, oh, no, we have somebody who had a problem, but they don't come anymore, so we don't have a need. So the point is, we're open to training people for sure, including professionals, PTs and OTs, because oftentimes people will have other kinds of issues as well. And physicians, you know, we do all of that. We train not just the person and not just the family members, because you're right. We in society have this impression that if someone can't get the words out, that the cognition is there, which is incorrect.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. Our first question, is primary progressive aphasia a problem of older age, or does it develop at any age?
It's people are usually like in their 60s when they develop primary progressive aphasia. So it's a fairly, I would say, a fairly young kind of a diagnosis. Oftentimes before the person is actually retired, they can still work. You know, you can forget words and still work and just kind of cover it up or whatever. And that generally happens. You hear people explaining that, you know, I'm still working, but I'm not the same. Something's different and it's getting worse. I'm not remembering more and more. It's more than my wife does or more than my, you know, brother does. So I know something's kind of wrong. And then, you know, you follow them and then you do see dissolution of you know, depending on the type of problem they have, the type of PPA, but it's in the 60s usually.
Okay.
Which is pretty young, you know.
Thank you. Yes, indeed it is. What is the underlying neuropathology of PPA?
Okay, in primary progressive aphasia, usually there's a difficulty on the left side of the brain in the frontal temporal area. And so depending on the specific type of PPA, you know, if it's one of the three, whichever one it is, that is because, you know, different parts of the brain are responsible for different sorts of things. And so, you know, frontal lobe with motor kinds of areas versus temporal lobe with comprehension sorts of things. So, and then any part of the brain that's affected will cause word finding difficulties. So, yeah.
Thank you. If one is diagnosed with aphasia and cognitive impairment due to stroke, will the person eventually get dementia?
You know, there's no definite. I know that with traumatic brain injury, there's a relationship between traumatic brain injury, there's a relationship between mental retardation, there's a relationship, some literature that talks about learning disabilities and dementia, you know, maybe being predictors or suggesting that the person might develop dementia. There's a hereditary factor. If your parents had it, then, or your grandparents had dementia of sorts, then you may be more susceptible. But other than that, that's about it. That's about the extent to the relationship.
Okay.
Yeah. So in other words, in terms of if you had a stroke, are you more likely to have dementia? No, there's no direct relationship. Although, like with Alzheimer's disease, some of the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease are like diabetes, hypertension, all the things that are risk factors for stroke. So in that sense, even though there may not be a direct relationship, oh, you had a stroke, you're definitely going to have dementia, or more than likely. If you still have the same risk factors, since they're the same risk factors, for that reason, you may develop that. All the more reason to get into that, what they call health literacy, right? And read about how to really take care of yourself with diet and exercise and rest, which people think I'm being lazy when I'm resting, but when you rest, that's when your body actually heals itself and you know, all the things. You'll destroy your body if you don't sleep, is what I'm saying. And many people have sleep apnea. So that's just an additional factor. So it just kind of depends on if you have risk factors that would predispose you to Alzheimer's or not.
Right. I guess it would also be dependent on whether you continue having strokes, right? I mean, sometimes people
point.
just have one and then they plateau and they don't have any more significant strokes.
Good point, because there's vascular dementia. So if a person, yes, if they had multiple strokes and they continue to have them, then, and there's certain kinds of diseases that predispose someone, even if they don't have like the risk factors for like the diet and exercise and all that, even if they're, you know, doing those sorts of things, there's certain kinds of diseases that predispose a person to stroke. So yeah, if you have multiple strokes, you would have a vascular dementia, and because meaning you would damage, you would hurt so many different parts of the brain that eventually it would surface as a dementia. Yes, you're correct, yeah. That's right on.
Our next question, is it harder to diagnose someone with PPA when they're bilingual and English is not their first language?
Okay, so I would imagine it's always harder if you don't speak the language the person speaks, because you've got to find an interpreter. And here's the issue. Interpreters are trained to be medical interpreters, but they are not trained to be speech pathologists. So that when we give someone a test, for instance, and I would imagine it's the same way when a neuropsychologist, who generally is in the picture before the speech pathologist, they work generally with the PCP and the neurologist to come up with the diagnosis, and then they don't do therapy. The neuropsychiatrists don't do therapy, they just do testing, so they refer them to you. But the point is that anytime you have someone who speaks a language you don't speak and you're working through an interpreter, you don't really know how accurate the testing is, right? You don't know how many cues. Like I might say, you know, I might want somebody to say, name this, water. And then the interpreter might say, name this, you know, come on, you know it, the stuff you drink. You don't really know what they're saying. So in that sense, I would imagine it's always difficult to work with someone who's bilingual. But if a person is bilingual, and they go to their doctor and they say in, I don't know, in Portuguese language and in English, both languages, I notice a difference. I'm having more trouble with the words. They come out a little jumbled, and I know what I want to say. It's just not coming out right. Or if they say, "Oh, my wife is talking to me, and now some of the words is crazy. I don't understand." They have to like show me an extra time. Honey, I said, pen, you're right. Oh, like at first, oh my God, I didn't understand it. So whether you have those symptoms in English or you have them in Portuguese or whatever language, the doctor should be alerted, like, oh my God, I hear what you're reporting. Let's follow up. And hopefully the neuropsychiatrist will have a good interpreter and they will tell them, don't give them extra cues, only do it this, hopefully it will be controlled, or they will be bilingual. We're
Right.
getting more bilingual trained folks. So if you are out there, good question, really good. They're all good questions. If you've got a need and you're bilingual, here at Chapman for this year, we have a faculty member, Dr. Henriette Langdon, who is a bilingual speech pathologist. So she could handle it. She speaks 5 different languages. Spanish is one of them, and she speaks 5 languages. She's with us for the year. So if you have a need, you've been diagnosed with PPA, and you don't have a bilingual speech pathologist and you're interested in looking into possibilities, please call us. And you've got my email up here, and I will connect you with Dr. Langdon, who I think is probably sitting in on this presentation.
That's wonderful. I mean, it's just been great today learning about all the resources that are available. We're all learning so much. I have another question that's a good one. What about signing? If people have PPA, can they sign what they want? Or does the brain damage just affect communication altogether?
It affects communication altogether. And so sign language is a valid language system, just like oral language. And in the same way that oral language is affected, sign language is too. Interesting, interesting, interesting. I've got a book that we've got a deadline for what, Friday? Oh, this Friday. But it deals with diversity as the previous question, and it deals with diversity not just in terms of different languages like Spanish and Portuguese, et cetera, but we've got a chapter in there on what do you do if someone has a stroke or someone has dementia and they use sign? Is it, is there dissolution of that? Yes. What do you do? How do you work with it? So the same concepts that we use as speech pathologists to help communication orally, we translate that into helping a person in whatever language they speak, and including if they don't speak the language, but they sign it. So very nice question. And if you've got an interest in that, let us know, and either we will have a person on our faculty or we will find someone to be of assistance to you. Very, very interesting.
A couple more questions. And some people lose their ability to speak or understand English as they age, but can communicate with their first language. Is this a type of aphasia?
Okay, so I'd have to see the person, because really you shouldn't lose a language because of age, but as you get older, you may lose a language that you don't practice. So I used to spend summers in American Samoa, and I used to attend a Samoan church, and they actually got to a point where I was adopted Samoan, and they thought I was Samoan, and they didn't even translate it anymore, and it forced me to understand it. But I haven't used it in several years. So the fact that I can't speak it now, it's not because I'm older, 6 or 7 years older, and it's because I haven't practiced it. So I would think it's more that, but if you're in question, then I would seek out, assistance and, get an evaluation by a bilingual person who's trained to, look at both languages and see what's really happening. Because maybe it's not just lack of use. Maybe they've been practicing, but they're still losing it. Something's going on. So check that out.
Okay. What would be the cause of aphasia in a younger person, such as a child?
Oh, okay. The very same causes as for adults. So, they can have different kinds of strokes. There's also a problem that's sort of rare, but not necessarily, especially among people of Asian ancestry, of the various Asian groups. There's something called moya moya that oftentimes occurs in children, and that's when you have like weak blood vessels in the brain and they burst, and you may have several aneurysms or pouched out parts of the blood vessel. Like a blood vessel would be just going along, but you would have a pouched out area, and then with enough pressure, it will burst, and then you'll have a hemorrhagic or bleeding stroke, which oftentimes, unfortunately, is fatal because the blood will press on the brain stem, but hopefully they'll catch it, they'll fix it, and then they'll repair all the other parts of the vascular system that are impaired so that the person won't get surprised and have another surprise stroke. Oftentimes people have weakened blood vessels and don't even know it, not to frighten anyone. But yeah, but there are many reasons for children to have, strokes. And to have language problems, there are many reasons. A child can have a traumatic brain injury. There are many different, a child can have a tumor, many different reasons. But if you have a child who has a problem, then you should definitely, I'm sure you're definitely seeking out, help with that. But I'd say contact me if you want more information, and we can talk about your individual case and see if I can give you some resources on pediatric stroke. There's not a whole lot, but there is literature. There's even there's a whole book or two, not many, on stroke in children and rehab.
That's very kind of you, Dr. Wallace. I've got a couple more questions for you, but before I ask them, I want to remind everyone that we'll be back next month on November 8th at 11:30 Pacific Standard Time. And our topic will be how nutritional needs change with age. And we have a great presenter that's going to talk to us about that topic. So be sure and mark your calendar again for Tuesday, November 8th at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. Okay, let's see, are different types of language skills located in different parts of the brain? Some people with head trauma can sing their conversations, but not speak normally. Interesting.
Exactly.
These are great questions.
Yeah, they really are, because the right side of the brain is the side of the brain that is responsible for melody and intonation and singing sorts of things, and also for very common overlearned information. And so if there's certain songs that you've got overlearned, and especially if it's a song with a melody, then the right hemisphere can generally help out with that. When the left side of the brain, that's the side generally, most people that houses the language in various parts of the brain, then the right can cross over this area called the corpus callosum and get information to the other side to kind of help boost the message up. There are even speech language therapy techniques. There's one like called melodic intonation therapy, where if a person, I'll just give you an example, if a person can't get the words out like that, they know what they want to say, doggone it, but they can't program, they can't order the sounds in the right way. You start off having them tap and sing it out. How are you? That kind of a thing. And oftentimes you're right, they can get it out. They can say happy birthday, they can overlearn things, but even things that aren't overlearned phrases, and you start with phrases that are meaningful to them in their world, in their life, their day-to-day life, and you try and train those to see if the right can help the left. So you're absolutely right.
Okay, we are really running out of time here, but just real quickly, are people with PPA able to communicate by using a computer? We asked about sign language. Now someone's asking about computer. Is it kind of the same? They need the cognition to be able to do that, right?
Beautiful question. Yeah, because when people especially get to the advanced stages, so that in any kind of dementia, so the communication is really difficult. You may be able to help them produce simple language using pictures, which low technology, not a big deal with computers. Or you may have an iPad and have, I can't think of the word, but I know what it is. I can't think. And then you have it on an iPad, or you have a list of words. Oh, it's that. Or you may have a notebook, all kind of different things with, people and places and food. And I can't. turn to the page and just point to it, or show it on a computer. So with high tech. So yeah, we've got all
Excellent.
kinds of things from beginning to end that we can use to help people communicate. We never give up. Never give up. So
Okay, well, thank you so much. This does bring us to the conclusion of our wonderful webinar today, and we thank Dr. Wallace so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us on this fascinating topic. For everyone who's still with us, and I think most of us have stayed, please watch for this survey that's going to open up as soon as I end the webinar for everyone. And again, that needs to be completed within 24 hours for those of you who are expecting to receive CE credit. See you next month on Tuesday, November 8th for how nutritional needs change with age. And don't forget that you can always visit our website here at Alzheimer's Orange County, www.alzoc.org, to learn more about some of the other educational programs and offerings that are available in our community. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Wallace, and everyone have a wonderful remainder of the day.